In the days after Pope Francis became the new head of the Roman Catholic Church, people were already speculating that he would usher in deep reforms of Catholicism. 9 months into the job and after the release of his first encyclical, does he still look like a reformer? Joining us now to help answer that, in Regina, Saskatchewan, John Meehan. He is president at Campion College. In Montreal, Quebec, Peter Stockland. He is publisher of Convivium magazine. And with us here in the studio, Alicia Ambrosio, producer and host at Salt and Light Television. And as I welcome everybody to the broadcast, I would like to, Alicia, start with you and ask, 9 months on the job, how's Pope Francis doing?
Well, it depends who you ask.
I'm asking you.
Well, I think he's doing pretty well, considering that he's doing a lot of things at what is breakneck speed for the Vatican.
Like what?
Well, he, pretty much a month after being elected, formed this Council of Cardinals who represent all the different continents and who don't work in the Vatican right now. And they've already sat twice, and both times we've come out of those meetings with big announcements after those meetings. So the last time they met, of course, it was announced that there is a new commission being created for the protection of minors. For many people, that's not fast enough. It's too little, too late. But if you watch the Vatican, if you know the Vatican, this is warp speed for the Vatican. The other thing I'm seeing, a lot of Catholics who perhaps had fallen away from the church or who are nominal Catholics are now looking at Francis and rediscovering their faith.
Hold off on that. We're going to touch on that more in a second. John Meehan, your view on how the new Pope is doing 9 months into the job.
Well, people who are looking for major reforms, who are critical of him, they haven't seen the reforms yet. It's often said that changing the Catholic Church is like turning the Queen Mary on a dime. It doesn't happen overnight. Given that, we've seen a change in style, which is leading to a change in substance. And the style is open, it's a stance of listening, it's open to dialogue, and above all, he keeps coming back to this point of a church of the poor, for the poor. So I think this message is getting out to all Catholics and beyond the Catholic Church, to all Christians, all people of faith, and to those of no faith.
Peter Stockland,
and we're all listening
to
Francis. That's a huge success in my view.
Okay. Peter?
I think one of the things that's most impressive is the sense of actual continuity rather than reform, where continuity is warranted and where continuity is beneficial. And there's a sense of growth. If you refer to the apostolic exhortation that's just come out, and if you do as I do, read papal documents, if you go back to John Paul II, there was an incredible largeness of spirit in his writing. For Benedict, there was, of course, the German theologian, but also an enormous charity in his encyclicals and in his writing. And with Francis, we have both those things, but we have a guy who can really write, not just think, but who's an incredible literary guy. Like, if you read these things, they're really fun to read. I mean, he talks about the confessional not being a torture chamber, but rather a place to go and meet God and do better. And he talks about evangelization not being something that makes us look like we come back from funerals. I mean, he's got one-liners sprinkled through this whole thing. And if you think of it in terms of his mission, which is outreach and the spreading of joy within the church, the actual spirit of the church, as opposed to the nuts and bolts mechanics of the Vatican Curia or so on, he's an incredible force for both continuity and growth.
But let's pick up on Alicia's comment from a moment ago, and John, I'll go to you first on this. A lot of very positive reviews less than a year into the new job, but do you see tangible evidence that Catholics are returning to the church that they may have gone away from over the intervening years? John, what do you think?
Well, in my own experience, I'm president of a college, so I teach Catholics and non-Catholics and others, and I'm hearing from a lot of non-Catholics that they're listening, or lapsed Catholics, that they're thinking of coming back to the church because of something Francis has said. So, that's anecdotal, but in my day-to-day experience, I hear that all the time. So I think people are listening to him in a way that they didn't listen to the other popes. And it started with his first appearance on that balcony when he bowed and asked people to pray for him. And some Catholics I know said, they're quite candid, they said, I've never prayed for a pope before, but I prayed for him because he asked me to. So it was an incredible gesture of humility on his part. And I think that's really set a tone for his papacy.
Alicia, what are you seeing?
I'm seeing a lot of the same. I have some friends who would consider themselves quite liberal, and confession isn't always something they get. And what I've heard from them is I'm going to confession on a regular basis because of what he says.
For the first time, presumably, in
For
years?
the first time in a long time, in some cases. If you're reading, I was reading The Guardian a few weeks ago, and there was an article in there about how atheists are using Pope Francis as their poster boy, their pinup boy. You know, other poster children have disappointed them, and now it's Pope Francis. And the main thing I'm hearing is that it's because they see that he walks the walk. He preaches it and he does it. And that's something you couldn't necessarily see so visibly in past popes. JP2 was all about the style, the personality.
He was a superstar.
Yeah, and you didn't doubt that he was a holy man, and you didn't doubt that he was living his faith, but you didn't see it, and it didn't look accessible. Remember that Francis spent as Jorge Bergoglio was leading Buenos Aires, and a vast majority of his work was in these villas miserias, the villages of misery they're called. And a lot of people in those villages are in desperate poverty, and they fall away from the faith not because they don't believe, but because it looks inaccessible. So they don't baptize their children, they won't get married. They'll just kind of try to live a good life, but whatnot. And he understood how to make the faith accessible there. And if you can do it there, in the most desperate of situations, well, maybe you've got a chance with the rest of the world.
Let me ask Peter the same question, and let's put it in the context of you are speaking to us tonight from the most Catholic province in Canada and the most secular province in Canada. How does it look where you're sitting?
We'll wait and see. I mean, I think 9 months is a very short time, and especially given the upheaval that this province has gone through and the way it's turned its back on the church, it's going to take an awful long time. I mean, I think that if someone from Quebec had been made pope, there might have been a bit of flood back to the church, but it wouldn't have been exactly a permanent phenomenon. And I think that that's something we have to be really careful of. You know, and I think we'll talk about this a bit later, but he's Francis is very critical of pure free market economics in the apostolic exhortation, and has been very open about it. We need to be careful about applying that to the church too. That the success of the church is something that you can just simply count, as a matter of sort of market appeal or marquee appeal. If people are coming back to the church, I think my sense is that Francis himself would say it's not because of him, it's because of the Holy Spirit. It's because the Spirit is moving in people's hearts. So in terms of judging the church about for like sort of doing nose counts and walking up and down the aisle and seeing how many people are in the pews, I'm not sure that's exactly the best measure of how successful a church is or how successful the Pope himself is.
Well, since you raised this, let me go to John Meehan now, because he did capture a great number of headlines around the world when he talked about the dangers of unfettered capitalism, and no less learned a biblical scholar than Rush Limbaugh said that was pure Marxism, what the Pope said. What did you think, John Meehan, about the advisability of the way the Pope put it?
I think he's making the church relevant. The church was in great danger of becoming irrelevant, and he's speaking to our world. There's a tremendous lack of leadership in our world. I'm not just talking in religious circles, but also business circles, political circles. And the leadership he's demonstrating is a type of servant leadership. It's a prophetic leadership where he's taking a stand on these issues that many people, even non-religious people, are upset about. The injustice in the world, the violence in the world, the intolerance in our world. And so he's taking a stand on this, and as Alicia pointed out, he's leading by example. And what I hear is that with him taking these positions of leadership, it's sending a strong signal to other religious leaders, but also to business leaders and political leaders. Transparency, dialogue, consultation, a stance against injustice. This has great appeal to people in our world who are starving for that form of leadership.
Rush Limbaugh aside, Alicia, did he say anything about capitalism that was particularly new coming out of the mouth of a pope?
Well, no. Benedict wrote an encyclical about 2 years ago, I believe, perhaps more. It's all blending together. But he said essentially the same thing. His key message in there about the economic system was, we're not putting the person at the center, and the end result is we're driven by profit, and look at what happened. This was just after the economic crash. So Francis has said the same thing in this exhortation. He just said it in a more forceful way, in a way that made more sense. I recall having to reread Benedict's encyclical where he dealt with this. I think it was Caritas in Veritate. I recall having to reread that paragraph 3 or 4 times to get what he was saying. With Francis, I picked it up like that. And it was quite clear. It was
because he's more accessible, he speaks a plainer language, is that why?
It is. It is. Again, you can't forget that Benedict is the German theologian. And his construction of his sentences was different, the construction of his ideas was different. And Francis has what I call, it's my mother's Argentine wit. I mean, it's to the point. Don't waste time adding flowers to it.
Well, since you're making the comparison with Benedict, his predecessor, Peter, let me go to you on this. The media attention, the play that the media are giving to the new Pope compared to his predecessor is like night and day. Why do you think that is?
I think Alicia puts her finger right on it. Part of it is simply the intellectual accessibility. If you actually look at Caritas in Veritate or Deus Caritas Est, the 2 great encyclicals from Benedict, the message that Francis is articulating is very much the same. But you're absolutely right. The accessibility, the literary quality, the writing, the sense of humor, it just shines through in Francis, where in Benedict it certainly didn't. But if you go back again to John Paul II, the economic message was the same. You go back to Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, who held out against both sharp dealers in the business community and unscrupulous agitators among people trying to foment social unrest. That was at the turn of the 20th century. So there's a consistency of economic thought across all these writings. But again, the difference really is that Francis writes in a way, as I've been reading the encyclical, I can't stop reading it. It's really a wonderful literary product.
John Meehan, what would you attribute the much more favorable coverage of this Pope to his predecessor to?
Well, I would say, first of all, he's an excellent communicator. He's first rate. His use of images, his homilies, people can connect to that. And secondly, his great love with the poor. He's in touch with people where they are. You don't sense he's preaching to you. Rather, he's speaking to people's real concerns. So I think he's got a message, and he's getting the message out there to people. I think he practices what he preaches. I think people want to see that from religious leaders.
Well, let me ask you this question, because you're a Jesuit priest, yes?
Yes, I am.
And he's the first ever Jesuit Pope, is he not?
Well, I said to people for years we'd never have a Jesuit Pope, so I'm wrong on that.
Okay, so he is the first. Do you see any sort of particularly Jesuit-inspired themes in what you've heard from him so far?
I've been giving talks on this very topic all over the place. He's thoroughly Jesuit. Everything that Jesuits say and do comes from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. When people asked who he is, he said, "I'm a sinner." And that's the foundation of Jesuit spirituality, that we are sinners but loved by God. The second Jesuit feature is his love of the poor, Church of the poor, for the poor. This has been pronounced in Jesuit ministries, especially since the late 60s and early 70s. And finally, his emphasis on joy and freedom. He's talking about in this latest apostolic exhortation, a gospel of joy. So that Christians have to be people of joy that attract people to the Christian message, rather than forcing that on anybody. So the way he's doing this is quite Jesuit. I think it's part of his training. Like part of my training too, and probably his as well, was living on the streets for a month with the poor. They give us $35 and a one-way bus ticket, and I lived on the streets of Seattle. And
if I could just jump in.
It's a bit artificial in a sense. It only lasted 1 month, but you spend a month on the streets with the poor. So not the poor as a concept or an ideology, but poor as people.
Really in the streets.
People have something to teach us. What I like about him is he's not ideological. He goes beyond ideologies within the church and outside the church to deal with the person.
Come on in, Peter.
Yeah, I'm just the other dimension, and it's simply an extension of what John's saying, is there's a rootedness in the world. There's an incarnate dimension to everything that Francis seems to say. This is concrete. This is specific. This is a church of dirty shoes, and it's a sense of this is not abstraction. It's not ideology by any means. And in fact, he talks about he really in the apostolic exhortation takes takes on this whole notion of ideological ethics. This is rooted faith. And if you go back to Lumen Fide, which was the sort of joint encyclical that Francis and Benedict wrote it, and then Francis kind of touched it up for him, it begins there with a sense that, look, the Christian faith is a faith that exists in the world. It's made of real stuff. And that, to me, is like, from what I know of Jesuit teaching and of the Jesuits, that is part and parcel of the Jesuit experience.
It's finding God in all things. That's the Jesuit spirituality, finding God in everything. So it's finding God in the world rather than seeking refuge from the world in this nice, comfortable, cozy, safe church.
But
finding God in the church, but especially in the world.
Okay,
I might have an anecdote that kind of sums it all up. Now, when I was living in Rome, I went to a parish that was led by Jesuit priests, and we would do a day of reflection, a retreat day up in Orvieto every March. And part of the retreat day was silent prayer. And I remember the retreat leader, a Jesuit, saying to us, remember, you can pray in front of cappuccino and cornetti. And so you would find us in Orvieto sitting at a table with cappuccino and cornetti praying. And that's, I think, what both Peter and John are trying to get at.
Nothing inconsistent.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, let me try raising the issue, Alicia, to you first. One of tone. Clearly you have all three described how this Pope is different from certainly his immediate predecessor, but also in some respects from John Paul II as well. There are some people who took his elevation to the office as a sign that we were going to see sweeping reforms in the church. But, I mean, let's be frank here. We're not going to see women priests. We're not going to see a change in the position on contraception or abortion or any of these kinds of things. So, in the main, are we talking about merely a change of tone as opposed to a change of position on significant issues? Alicia.
Well, I have two thoughts on that.
Sure.
The first being that even a change in tone or style doesn't happen in a vacuum. So it's not superficial. It might not be the change that certain parties outside and inside the church might want to see, but there is a change happening. The other thing is, if you go to a parish, to your average parish, and talk to average Catholics about what is the church's teaching on contraception, what is the church's position on women priests, you probably find that a lot of people don't quite understand the church's teaching on those matters. So how can you change it if you haven't gotten, if your flock doesn't quite understand what it is? And when there's a full understanding, they might just find that what's written in canon law or what's written in doctrine isn't quite what they thought was there. And I don't know, John might disagree with me.
Yeah, Steve, I think when we look at church history, we should be very skeptical of saying the church never changes. The church is a living organism. It does change. And we look at our history and things have changed. Not the essential core beliefs.
Well, I was going to say, not on the big things, not on the core things, right?
Not on the essential core beliefs, and I'm talking here the creed, but other matters of discipline, of custom, of culture. These things do change. And what we have, and this is another Jesuit feature of this Pope, is an emphasis on discernment. Where is the Spirit, where is the Holy Spirit working through our church and our world? Where are we called to go? And an example, concrete example of this was last week I received an email that said, time-sensitive information from Rome. I don't get many of those. And it was a survey that's being sent to all the parishes across the world, to nine areas to look at, including things like the teaching on marriage, on the family, on same-sex unions, on children from same-sex unions, on separated and divorced people. How are these issues being dealt with in your parish? And all this information is going to go to Rome. They're going to collate this for the upcoming synod on the family and evangelization. So that is very Jesuit as well. To see the Holy Spirit working not just in the upper echelons of the church, among the Pope and the bishops and hierarchy and magisterium, but also through ordinary believers. They are the church. We are the church. The church is the people of God. And that was so strong in Vatican II. And this Pope is certainly a product of Vatican II.
You know, if I could just say, though, you know, one of the things I think the media has done a really, really bad job of are either articulating or understanding, or certainly maybe one leads into the other, is the notion that the Church's teachings on sexuality, on abortion, and so on, proceed from the same place as its teachings on the economy and on the preferential option for the poor and the treatment of the poor. It's a particular understanding of the human person. It doesn't accept certain notions of autonomy that are now part and parcel of what we call the modern world. Those ideas, those teachings, they're not just grabbed out of the air for the sake of being contrarian. They're not just created because the Catholic Church wants to boss people around. They are intrinsic to the Church's understanding of what it means to be human and what it means to be a child of God. And so to change those things is essentially to change the fundamental nature, the fundamental teaching, the fundamental mission of the Church, and to think, and to create this kind of media expectation that those things will change at the snap of a finger or a snap of fingers.
But Peter, what we haven't always
just a
done
game.
a good job as a church is reminding people of the reason for this teaching. And oftentimes the church is being perceived as saying no to this, no to that, no to something else. And we have to keep reminding people that that no is part of a bigger yes. A yes to the dignity of the human person, a yes to human life, a yes to the beauty of human sexuality. And what this Pope is doing is giving us that context of the greater yes. And so that the church isn't always being perceived as saying no all the time.
Well, let me read something here that Michael Brendan Doherty did in Slate magazine back in the summertime. And then, Alicia, I'll get you to comment on this first, since we're talking about sexual ethics here and what the Pope can or can't change as it relates to the teachings of the Church. The news wires have been buzzing since Pope Francis gave an informal interview to journalists on his airplane Monday and said, quote, "A gay person who is seeking God, who is of good will, well, who am I to judge him?" He went on to say that homosexuals are, quote, "our brothers and sisters who should not be marginalized." Did the Pope just soften the Church's teaching on homosexuality? This writer is asking, and he says, not really. But what people are really responding to is, it's no big deal, man, that spirit. Francis projects the serene confidence of an Episcopalian with 4 aces. Intentionally or not, His Holiness has called into question the official and mostly ignored policy of the Church set by the predecessor he is anxious to canonize, Pope John the 23rd, who barred gays from the priesthood in 1961. What's your view, Alicia, on whether or not he is more open to a more complicated, sexually ethical world?
Well, I think John hit on something a little bit earlier when he said that Francis is in tune with the world. He's rooted in the world. I mean, let's be frank. Many popes, many bishops that we've had have kind of entered the seminary at a very young age and moved up through the ranks very insulated from the outside world. Francis has been in the trenches and has seen the complexity. And he's also understanding that if you can't, we need to get a full picture of what today's reality is. And if we can't answer to today's reality, well, we're going to lose, we're going to become irrelevant.
He's the first pope to use the word gay, I think.
Yes.
What did you think of that?
I think so, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's language that everyone understands. Until now, in Catholic circles, you would hear the term people who are attracted to the same sex, because they're trying to make the distinction between being attracted to the same sex and living a certain lifestyle that has become connected to the word gay. But he understands that, I mean, come on, same-sex attraction is much longer than saying gay. He understands that if I use these words, everyone's going to be with me.
Well, John Meehan, was there a sense that it's about time I, on behalf of the Church, called this community what this community likes to be called? Was there some of that in his decision to use the word?
Well, on that interview you talk about on the plane coming back from Brazil, it was refreshing because what it shows is his pastoral side. You know, there's the church teaching, and we can go on and on ad nauseum about the church teaching and how also it has evolved on this point. If you compare the catechisms of the past and the most recent one, which condemns homophobia as a sin, a form of hatred, and recognizes that homosexual orientation has always existed. But what we see in this Pope is a pastoral side. To diffuse the political side, I mean, everything, including homosexuality, has been politicized in our world. And he's saying no to that. He's saying, let's treat the person. Let's deal with the person.
But John,
is this person loving? Is this person human?
Go ahead, Peter.
I was just going to say, sorry, I thought you had finished there. My apologies.
Yeah.
You and I
It's a
both know, John,
pastoral.
that in 1986, then Cardinal Ratzinger issued a pastoral letter in which he just eviscerated any thought that of unjust discrimination against homosexual people. Now, there was some language in it that perhaps wouldn't pass muster today. It was at the first flowering of the gay rights movement, and thoughts evolve over time. But if we go back to that 1986 pastoral letter, which itself was a development from an earlier letter in the 1970s, that the Church was clear even back then, and made it clear again in the Catechism of the early 90s, that unjust discrimination against homosexual persons was essentially anathema to Catholic teaching, anathema to the Church. So I wish people in my profession, reporters, journalists, would actually look at these documents, and when they make these kinds of statements about the Church being anti-gay and so on, would actually trace the historical past, the relatively recent historical past, and say, okay, look, this is an evolution of the Church. It's not a revolution.
Okay, just a few minutes to go. I want to put one more quote on the table. This from a well-known New York Times columnist who was writing about a month or so ago when he said, "Now it's your turn to be part of the loyal opposition," a fellow Catholic journalist said to me earlier this year as Pope Francis's agenda was beginning to take shape. The friend was a political liberal and lifelong Democrat, accustomed to being on the wrong side of his church's teaching on issues like abortion, bioethics, and same-sex marriage. Now, he cheerfully suggested, right-leaning Catholics like me would get a taste of the same experience from a pope who seemed intent on skirting the culture war and stressing the Church's mission to the poor instead. Alicia, your thoughts on that comment?
Oh boy. Well, I work in Catholic media, so we tend to get it from both sides. If we do something that the people on the right don't like, we get it. If we do something that isn't quite open enough, we get it from the left.
That's called doing your job.
Yeah, well, exactly. If
they all don't like it,
you're in the middle,
your
you're doing great. This has a ring of truth to it for me, from what I've seen. And in that exhortation, Francis pretty much blasts and he flat out, he doesn't mince words. He flat out says, if you're holding on to a style of worship that you believe is correct because it's linked to doctrinal purity or whatever, get over it. Essentially, well, he almost does say, get over it. So it is true, we are seeing more and more Catholics on that right-leaning side who are not happy with this because they're feeling that they're being told their love of this tradition is wrong.
They liked Benedict better.
They did like Benedict better, but remember that a lot of the stuff that comes with, a lot of the stuff that comes on that right, a lot of the things they're holding on to are things that come from a very specific history. So the groups that are very much tied to older forms of worship forget that all the visual stuff you see in these older forms of worship come out of a time, in some cases, out of Roman times. I mean, the red shoes were a sign of aristocracy in Roman times. And the Pope is not supposed to be that. The Pope is the successor of a fisherman. Right. The older forms of worship came out of very specific historical times where class structure was different. And we don't believe that anymore.
Let me, Peter, with just a couple of minutes left, let me put this to you here. I mean, it's all going really well for this Pope so far. And I wonder whether you are concerned that he's enjoying, in some respects, as a new politician does, a bit of a honeymoon phase here, but that the honeymoon, it never lasts forever, right?
Yeah. Popes don't take honeymoons by their nature. They skip the honeymoon.
Very droll.
I don't think whether a pope remains popular before the world's media or not, as I said earlier, is really the measure of his success. I know the story of an Italian priest who used to bicycle 30 kilometers to preach to a small group, and sometimes nobody would show up, and yet he would keep going because one person might show up. Ultimately, that's the mission of any priest in the church, of any bishop, of the Pope himself, is to save one soul at a time, to be part of the process of saving one soul at a time. Yeah. So his popularity, 9 months from now, is really not the issue. The issue is the Holy Spirit moving through the church, moving through the world.
That's right.
Understood. Yeah. John Meehan from Campion College in Regina, we're so glad you could join us on the line from Saskatchewan tonight.
Thank
Peter
you.
Stockland from Convivium Magazine in Montreal, happy to have you participate as well. And Alicia Ambrosio, the Vatican Connections, Salt and Light TV. Thank you for being here as well.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Steve.
you so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.